Hi, boys and girls. We are ready to finish our story if you traveled west in a covered wagon. I hope you've enjoyed this adventure with me, and let's find out how it finishes today. Thank you, Scholastic, for helping us with this reading, and thank you for Ellen Levine, who's the author and the illustrator, Elroy Freem. I hope you have really enjoyed this adventure. Without road signs, how would you know where you were? It wasn't always easy. It may be hard to imagine that you could get lost, but out on the open prairie, everything looked the same. Huge fields of waving grass. One pioneer wrote that everybody was so turned around that they were uncertain which was the right way to go. Sometimes you got help from trees or rocks or water holes. In places on the trail, there were big rocks with funny shapes, or water that looked and tasted unusual, or trees that were bent in strange ways. The early fur trappers and traders who had gone west had given names to many of these things. So when the pioneers traveled in their covered wagons, they looked for these landmarks. When you saw one, you knew you were going in the right direction. You also knew how far you had come. One famous landmark was called Chimney Rock. It was a tall column sitting on a bed of rock and rose about 500 feet from the ground into the air, about 40 stories high. You can probably guess why it was called that name. When you reached Chimney Rock, you had traveled some 550 miles from Independence, Missouri. Another famous landmark was Independence Rock. Some people say that it got that name because early travelers reached it on July 4th and celebrated Independence Day there. It was a great rock shaped like a turtle's back, and you could see it from far away. Independence Rock was a favorite place to climb. You also knew who had traveled before you because many people carved or painted their names into the rock. In one spot, a whole wagon train joined together and painted the Oregon Company, 1843, on the rock. Children loved one landmark called Soda Springs. It had bubbling water that you could drink. When you bent your head near the water, the bubbles tickled your nose. And there was a place called Steamboat Springs. Here, water came rushing up 2 to 3 feet in the air from cracks in the rock. It was blowing, splashing, and spraying, whizzing and sizzling, and making the puff-puff sound of a steamboat. There was also a very scary landmark that Jesse Applegate called Devil's Backbone. If you think about how narrow your backbone is, you'll understand why this was a place you would never forget. When Jesse's wagon train reached Devil's Backbone in 1843, the trail was very narrow. On the left side, the cliff went down about 1,000 feet. On the right side, it was worse. The cliff went all the way down to the Snake River, which seemed about a mile down. And here's a picture of that. And that mile is 5,280 feet. At some spots on Devil's Backbone, there was room for not much more than a wagon. Then everybody got out and walked in front of and behind the wagons until the trail got wider. If you travel west today, you can see all of those places yourself. What is the Continental Divide? If you drew an imaginary line along the top of the Rocky Mountains from the north to the south, you would have drawn what's called the Continental Divide. This is the place in the United States where the great rivers flow in different directions. On the west side, all the rivers flow toward the Pacific Ocean. On the east side, they all flow toward the Atlantic Ocean. The wagons crossed the Continental Divide at a place called South Pass. It was an opening in the mountains that was so wide it didn't seem as if you had crossed anything very important. Then you reached a spot called Pacific Springs. There you could watch the first waters on your trip flowing west. You knew you were at least halfway to Oregon. What special tricks of the trail did the pioneers learn? When you lived for 5 or 6 months in a covered wagon, traveling almost every day, you had to learn or invent new ways to do things. Here's a problem that pioneers had to solve. What would you do when the oxen's feet got sore? If you got tired from walking and your feet were very sore, you could climb up in the wagon and ride for a while. But what were the oxen supposed to do? The pioneers learned a trick from the Indians. First, you cut a small piece of animal skin. Then you make small holes all around the edges and put a string or narrow strip of leather through the holes to make a drawstring. You then put the side with the hair around the ox's foot and pull the string up tight and tie it like shoelace. After 2 days of wearing these makeshift moccasins, the ox's feet would be better. So you're like making little shoes for them. It was also very important to know how to find your way back to the wagon train if you got lost out on the prairie. The trail was usually close to the river, so you would be safe if you could find your way to the water. If you had gone out exploring on the prairie, it wasn't always easy to see the river. Although the land looked flat, the rivers usually ran in a valley. Sometimes the sides of the riverbanks were 60 feet high. The secret was to follow the buffalo tracks. The buffalo walked in single file, many rows of them, to the river to drink. So their paths were sometimes 10 inches deep and a foot wide. You couldn't miss them. The pioneers also learned how to leave messages on the trail for wagons coming after them. Sometimes notes were written on the bones of cattle that had died along the way. Do you remember the other tricks of the trail described in this book? How do you make butter while the wagon is moving? How do you keep eggs from breaking as you ride over bumpy trails? How do you dry meat to make it last a long time? How do you make fire without wood? And there's a little girl trying to follow the trail and get to the water. How do we know what it was like to travel west in a covered wagon? We know a lot about the wagon trains from diaries that the pioneers wrote. When you keep a diary, you try to write down what happens every day. You write about what you see and think. You can write down anything that interests you, including what other people say and do. Many diaries were written by grown-ups, but sometimes children wrote them too. Helen Scott was 11 years old when she traveled west in a covered wagon, and she kept a diary. Jesse Applegate was also young when his family went to Oregon. He didn't write a diary then, but he wrote about the trip when he grew up. One thing he remembered was how big the prairie dog cities were. He said he thought some seemed as great as New York City. And Helen Carpenter was 19 years old when she went west and wrote in her diary that buffalo meat was delicious. You can learn a lot about the Oregon Trail from reading diaries because each person wrote about different things. If you were a shoemaker, you might write about how the Indians made moccasins. If you were a doctor, you might name all the plants you saw that would make good medicines. If your wagon wheel broke, you might write about how to make a new one. What do you think you would have written about? Is there anything left of the Oregon Trail? Today, you can drive on highways over much of the old Oregon Trail. Although along the way, you can see some of the places you have read about in this book. In fact, at many places on the Oregon Trail, you can stand in the wagon ruts made by the covered wagons that went west so many years ago. Thank you for sharing with me this journey if you traveled west in a covered wagon.